Hey there, this is Dr. Ramey. Let's talk about some important concepts from Chapter 4, specifically aerobic cellular respiration. So, aerobic cellular respiration allows organisms, animals such as ourselves, to take food, forms of chemical energy, and convert that to an energy currency called ATP, which is required by many chemical reactions in every single one of our cells. So when we eat, we're actually not only acquiring the different nutrients that we need to grow, but also a source of energy that our cells need to keep those energy requiring chemical reactions occurring. So let's look at one cell, for example, and see what's taking place in a single cell. So if I draw this big kind of oval here, and let's say that represents a cell, and then another important component in here when it comes to aerobic cellular respiration is, of course, the mitochondria. So I'm going to draw the mitochondria here, and a mitochondria is an organelle, and sometimes that organelle is referred to as the kind of powerhouse of the cell, because most of the ATP that's produced inside a cell is produced in the mitochondria. The mitochondria has a double membrane. Okay, so I'm going to say that this big thing here is a cell, and this little thing here, this double membrane, is the mitochondria. Okay, and when you eat, many of those molecules that are in the food that you eat make it into your cells. One of those molecules being a form of chemical energy known as glucose, right? Glucose. So glucose, the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. It's not a very good 12, so let's see if I can fix that. So C6H12O6. Okay, so this is a simple sugar, a monosaccharide, and when glucose comes in or is imported into the cell, it's used in a process called glycolysis, and glycolysis takes place outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. Right, so inside the cell, but not inside the mitochondria. This is the only component that's important in aerobic cellular respiration that takes place outside of the mitochondria. So glycolysis starts the process of breaking down that glucose, right? And it produces a molecule known as pyruvate. This process of glycolysis also produces a little bit of ATP, but for one molecule of glucose, we only get a net production of 2 ATP molecules. Just a net production of 2 ATP molecules. This pyruvate is then converted into a molecule called acetyl-CoA, and what I refer to as the bridge reaction. And then acetyl-CoA is shuttled into the citric acid cycle. So the citric acid cycle. And in the citric acid cycle, a little bit more ATP gets made, around 2 more ATP. Oops. In addition to ATP, there's some energy or some other molecules that are important for energy production called NADPH, and there's also some NADPH that are produced in the citric acid cycle, and FADH2. Now, those sound like some weird molecules, I know. But what you need to, the important thing I want you to remember now for this class is, the importance of ATP, right? The whole purpose of this process, cellular respiration, is to produce as much ATP as possible using molecules, forms of chemical energy like glucose, right? Glucose is always used as an example because more ATP can be produced using glucose than any other form of chemical energy. But there are other forms of chemical energy that can be used to produce ATP, but we're going to focus on glucose. The process is more or less the same with these other molecules as well. So fine, ATP is needed because it's the energy currency of the cell. What about these other things that are produced, like NADPH and FADH2? Well, they're what we call electron carriers, or high energy electron carriers. And electrons, if you want to talk about energy production or think of energy production, then see where the energy is going, then follow the electrons. And in this case, the electrons are going to be shuttled into a process known as the electron transport chain. And if we say that around 32 molecules of ATP can be produced per molecule of glucose, well, we've only accounted for a fraction of that so far, right? We've talked about glycolysis a little bit, but only 2 ATPs are produced in glycolysis. We've talked about the citric acid cycle a little bit, but only another, it turns out, another 2 ATP are produced here. And this is always per molecule of glucose. Well, that's only, 4 ATP. So that means that the electron transport chain is going to be responsible for the production of another around 28 ATP. Now, I say around because it's not exact. It can go up or down a little bit, but it's usually in the low to mid 30s total. So if we use 32 as a good average number there, then that means that 28 of those 32 ATPs are going to be produced in the electron transport chain. And how does that happen? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it requires all the electrons that are all the high energy electrons that are carried to the electron transport chain in the form of NADPH and FADH2. Okay, so this is it's a messy drawing, I know, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overall feel for what's going on in aerobic cellular respiration. And speaking of aerobic, why do we call it aerobic cellular respiration? Well, it turns out that this last part of the puzzle here, the electron transport chain, requires oxygen. So oxygen goes in, water comes out, along with a lot of ATP. But without oxygen, none of this happens. The electron transport chain doesn't happen. The citric acid cycle can't happen. The only thing that can happen in the absence of oxygen is glycolysis, and glycolysis only yields 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. So in order to produce enough ATP, right, to supply, to provide the energy requirements of the cell, the only way to do that is in the presence of oxygen. So oxygen requiring means it's aerobic, right? It's an aerobic process. And this is why we breathe. We breathe to extract the oxygen from the air, the atmosphere. And the reason we need to extract the oxygen from the air is because it's used as what's called the terminal electron acceptor. Terminal electron acceptor. Right here. Okay, so there's an overall of this particular concept. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of each step a little bit, right? So step 1, right, glycolysis. Respiration always starts with glycolysis. Even other forms of ATP production always starts with glycolysis. And the reason is glycolysis is universal. All organisms on this planet anyway utilize some form of glycolysis. So glycolysis, as I mentioned, typically starts with a molecule of glucose. So here's glucose has got 6 carbons. Remember C6H12O6. So here are those 6 carbons right here. Okay? And glucose is being broken down in the process of glycolysis. Ultimately, one molecule of glucose results in 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, so the electrons that are carried in glucose are high energy electrons. So when an electron is removed from a molecule, we say that that molecule is oxidized. Okay, so this process is a process of oxidation. Okay, that means electrons are being removed. Where are those electrons going? Well, remember that we have these high energy electron carriers like NADH, right? Some of the electrons are still in pyruvate. The other high energy electrons are going to end up with these high energy electron carriers that are ultimately going to dump off those high energy electrons in the electron transport chain. So this process of glucose oxidation begins in glycolysis. And there's an energy investment phase here. Some of the first steps of glycolysis actually require some ATP. Now down here, a little bit later in the process, 4 ATP are made. But remember I said that 2 ATP are produced in glycolysis. Well, it's more accurate to say that there's a net of 2 ATP. So there's a net production of 2 ATP. That's because there's 4 ATP made, but 2 ATP are consumed. So there's a net production of 2 ATP. Okay, so there's a net gain, in other words, of 2 ATP in this process. So here's these ATP molecules, and those ATP molecules are going to go out and be used in energy requiring biochemical reactions. There's a little bit of ATP produced here. Then we're left with these 2 molecules of pyruvate. This is again per molecule of glucose. So 1 molecule of glucose results in the production of these 2 molecules of pyruvate. So from here on out, we're going to be looking only at 1 molecule of pyruvate and what happens to that. But remember, for everything that we see here, we're going to have to double it in terms of what's being produced per molecule of glucose. So pyruvate and pyruvic acid, for all intents and purposes, are the same molecule. Okay, so pyruvic acid is produced. 2 molecules of pyruvic acid are produced per molecule of glucose in glycolysis. And remember, glycolysis, let me go back one, took place outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. And what's happening here is taking place in the mitochondria. So there's this section here where pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl-CoA, right? So I'm outlining this in this red box rectangle here. I call that the bridge reaction because it bridges glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. Okay, because pyruvic acid comes out of glycolysis but cannot go into the citric acid cycle. Okay, that doesn't work. So it has to first be converted into acetyl-CoA, this molecule here, which then enters the citric acid cycle. So this bridge reaction converts pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA. And it takes place in the mitochondria. It's easy to remember. The only thing that does not take place in the mitochondria, or the only component of aerobic cellular respiration that does not take place in the mitochondria, is glycolysis. Everything else is taking place inside the mitochondria. So we've got the bridge reaction. There's no ATP that's produced in the bridge reaction, but there's some other important things that are produced here. Most notably, more high energy electron carriers. Where is that NADH going to go? To the electron transport chain, right? So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So that's important because any production of NADH or FADH2 ultimately is going to yield more ATP, right? And then the other thing that's produced in the bridge reaction, it's not important in terms of energy production, but you do recognize this molecule here, carbon dioxide, and that is where some of the carbon dioxide that you are exhaling right now came from, that bridge reaction. The rest of the carbon dioxide that you're exhaling right now came from the citric acid cycle. So there's no ATP that's produced here in the bridge reaction, but there is some NADH. Now, if I asked a question like, well, how many NADHs are produced in the bridge reaction per molecule of glucose, then the answer would be 2. 2 NADHs would be. And why 2? Because remember, 2 pyruvic acids were produced per molecule of glucose back in glycolysis. So we have to double everything that we're looking at here if we think of it in terms of per molecule of glucose. Okay, so we're getting actually 2 acetyl-CoAs produced per molecule of glucose, and everything that you see here in the citric acid cycle is doubled in terms of per molecule of glucose. So per molecule of glucose, we get 6 NADHs that are produced, we get 2 FADHs that are produced, and we get 4 CO2s. So the CO2s aren't important in terms of ATP production. They're a waste product that you're exhaling. But the NADHs and the FADH2s are really important because they're going to be going and dumping off those high energy electrons in the electron transport chain. The other important thing that's produced here in the citric acid cycle is, of course, ATP. We get 2 molecules of ATP that are produced here per molecule of glucose, and of course those ATP, being the energy currency of the cell, is going to go out and be used up in energy requiring chemical reactions. So here we have the citric acid cycle, and you know where the ATP, what the ATP is being used for. Now let's talk about where the high energy electron carriers are going and what is happening with those high energy electrons. So the next step then is going to be the electron transport chain. So we have these high energy electron carriers that are coming out of glycolysis, out of the bridge reaction, and out of the citric acid cycle, and they are dumping off their high energy electrons. See, here's NADH there, and then you have FADH2 here. So these high energy electron carriers are dumping off those high energy electrons in the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is this are these proteins and coenzymes that are embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So if we look at this box here from your text, this is representing the mitochondria. This is the outer membrane of the mitochondria, and then this is the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So you can see these enzymes and protein components of the electron transport chain are embedded in this inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, you can see the citric acid cycle took place inside the mitochondria there. So let me erase some of this. All right, and switch to a different color. So now you know where the components of the electron transport chain are. Well, what are they doing? Well, it turns out that these electrons that are being dumped off, you can see they're being dumped off here, they're being dumped off here. They're high energy electrons, and then they're being shuttled. This is why it's called the transport chain, right? The electrons are kind of being passed along, kind of like a hot potato, from protein to protein to protein to coenzyme to protein. And for this class, the specific identity of these enzymes and proteins is not really the important concept I want you to understand. It's why this is happening and what is the result. Of course, it's happening to produce ATP. That's the result, is more ATP production. The how is complex, but in general, these these high energy electrons, as they're being passed from enzyme to enzyme to enzyme, right? They're actually, some of the energy that they possess is being used to pump protons, right? So these H pluses are protons. Protons can also be called hydrogen ions, because really they're just a hydrogen atom that have been stripped of the electron. Same thing. Okay, so in here, in this space in between the inner membrane and the outer membrane of the mitochondria, there's a high concentration of protons. That high concentration of protons is made possible by the pumping of the electron transport chain. The pumping of the electron transport chain requires energy because they're pumping these protons up the concentration gradient. That's equivalent to, or analogous, I should say, to water flowing uphill. Well, the only way that we can get water to flow uphill is to pump it. And pumping requires energy. Well, the energy to pump these protons uphill comes from the high energy electrons. Now, there's no ATP that's produced here, but there's a concentration gradient of protons that's produced. So why is that important? Well, think of it as a dam. Think of a dam with a lot of water behind it. And what happens when the water flows through the turbines that are contained within the dam, is those turbines, the water turns the turbines and produces electricity. Well, there's an analogous mechanism here that's occurring in the mitochondria. The turbines are these special proteins called ATP synthase. And ATP synthases are embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and they allow the hydrogen ions to flow through them down the concentration gradient. So they're going to flow from an area of high concentration, there's lots of them over here, to an area of low concentration. Okay, they can only flow through ATP synthase, just like water flowing through a dam, right? The water behind the dam, there's a lot more of it than the water on the other side of the dam. Same thing here, there's a lot more hydrogen ions, a lot more protons on one side of the dam or the inner mitochondrial membrane. So you could think of the inner mitochondrial membrane as the dam. You can think of the ATP synthase molecules that are embedded in the membrane as the turbines. And instead of water flowing through ATP synthase, hydrogen ions, these protons, flow through it, and instead of electricity being produced as a result, ATP is being produced as a result, right? So you get a lot of ATP production here as a result of the actions of ATP synthase. This is known as chemiosmosis. This process here is known as chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis. Chemical osmosis, right? Again, osmosis is water moving across a membrane, but in this case it's not water, it's protons moving across a membrane, hence the chemi part, chemiosmosis. And I mentioned that oxygen was needed. Well, looky here. We have oxygen, O2, that is needed as the what's called the terminal, I'm running out of room here, but oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor. I already wrote that in the other slide, right? The terminal electron acceptor, meaning that the electron gives up all of its energy to the electron transport chain, and then when it has no more energy to give, it's then accepted by oxygen, and that process of there produces water, right? And that water is going to end up in a process known as photosynthesis that we're going to talk about in the next chapter, and that's when those electrons get recharged and put back into glucose. So we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So the ATP that's produced here per molecule of glucose is equivalent to around 28 ATP. So for glycolysis, there were 2, a net of 2. Citric acid cycle, a net of 2, ATP, and then another 28 as a result of the actions of the electron transport chain and ATP synthase to produce an additional 28 molecules of ATP. That adds up to 32 molecules of ATP total, and that's per molecule of glucose. Per molecule of glucose. So if we kind of summarize all this, right, we start with glycolysis. Well, I should say we start with glucose. So let me just start over here, and I'm going to change my color. So we start with glucose. Glucose is converted to pyruvate, and that process is glycolysis. Takes place outside of the mitochondria and produces a net of 2 ATP, and it produces some NADPH. And then the pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA in the bridge reaction. So I could say this is the bridge reaction, and it doesn't produce any ATP. There's some CO2 that comes out here. Not really important in terms of ATP production, but at least now you know where that CO2 is coming from that you're exhaling, some of it, and it's producing some more NADPH, right? And then we have, and by the way, starting from here over, right, we're now inside the mitochondria, and acetyl-CoA is going to go into the citric acid cycle. All right, so that acetyl-CoA is going to go into the, and I'll change my color here to try to stay consistent, the citric acid cycle. So I'm just going to put citric acid cycle. Okay, and out of the citric acid cycle, we get some more ATP, right? So we get another 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. We get some more NADPH and another electron carrier, FADH2, DH2. Okay, so then we have the electron transport chain. So if I just put ETC over here and plus ATP synthase, I'm running out of room. Okay, so we get the NADH here, here, and then FADH and NADH is here, all shuttling their electrons to the electron transport chain. And remember, the electron transport chain is going to pump protons across the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's all it's going to do. And then those protons, are they going to be fall through ATP synthase as they fall down their concentration gradient, producing a lot more ATP through the process of chemiosmosis. And per molecule of glucose, that is 28 ATP. Okay, so then we have 28 here, 2 ATP here, 2 ATP here, for a total ATP production of around 32 ATP per molecule of glucose. Now, I also wanted to mention too that oxygen, O2, is required right here in the electron transport chain, because remember, oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor. Okay, and I'm going to stop there. That's a wrap. The aerobic cellular respiration is complex. But it is an amazing process with a lot of different components. What I want you to focus on is the overall big picture, right? Why is it important? What is so important about aerobic cellular respiration? What is so important about forms of chemical energy like glucose and ATP. And what does that mean to your cell? And how does that relate or tie into why you have to eat and why you have to breathe? Well, this kind of answers those questions, right? So don't focus on the every minute detail. Like, I'm not going to ask you the identity of all the enzymes that are involved in the citric acid cycle or glycolysis, right, or even the electron transport chain, but I want you to understand the big picture here and be able to identify some of the main components, the main molecules, what NADPH is, and why it's important, and how it's connected to the electron transport chain and ATP synthase and all of those things. So think, the bigger picture of this concept, right? Okay, I hope that helps everyone, and we will talk about some other aspects of this chapter as well as how they all tie into photosynthesis in the next chapter.